They called him the shepherd, but his flock would soon discover that he was leading them down a path of destruction. For in the heart of this evil pastor, a malevolent spirit stirred, feeding on the very souls he was sworn to protect. Join me as we uncover the terrifying tale of the evil pastor, a cautionary story of faith, deception, and the horrors that lurk in the darkest recesses of the human heart. But before we dive into this chilling folktale, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel name, and hit that notification bell so you can stay updated on all our latest stories, legends, and myths. In a small, quiet town, there stood a modest church, its white walls weathered by time but still a beacon for many who sought solace. Pastor Samuel Dixon had been the heart and soul of the church for over a decade. His sermons were known to inspire, his prayers to heal, and his presence brought an undeniable sense of peace to the town. People came to him with their burdens, seeking divine intervention for the most desperate of problems. And time again, their prayers seemed to be answered in ways that could only be described as miraculous. But beneath the surface of this man of God, there was a darkness that no one could have imagined. It started innocently enough. Pastor Dixon had always been an empathetic leader, listening to the stories of suffering and loss that his congregation faced. He held regular prayer meetings, where he would lay his hands on the sick and troubled, offering them hope. Yet, the miracles he performed seemed to grow increasingly extraordinary. A woman blind for years suddenly regained her sight. A paralyzed man stood and walked, taking his first steps after decades of being bedridden. And perhaps most perplexing of all, children born with life-threatening conditions miraculously healed overnight. News of these wonders spread quickly, and soon people came from all over the country, desperate to witness the power that emanated from Pastor Dixon. But as his fame grew, so too did the whispers. A small group of longtime members began to notice something strange. People who had come to Pastor Dixon seeking healing often disappeared after their prayers. At first, it seemed like coincidence. Patients discharged from the hospital, relatives of the healed patients speaking of new jobs or fresh starts in far-off cities. But these disappearances became harder to ignore. There was something more to it. And one woman, Eleanor, could no longer shake the feeling that the miracles came at a cost. Eleanor, a quiet woman in her late 40s, had been part of the church since its inception. She had seen every miracle and every transformation, but something in the air felt wrong. It was as if the church, the pastor, and even the people themselves were becoming a little too perfect, a little too willing to accept anything in the name of faith. Her suspicions grew when she began to overhear hushed conversations late at night in the church's office. The words were unintelligible, but there was a sense of urgency, a tone that was darker than the usual prayers. Driven by her suspicions, Eleanor began to follow the pastor after one of the evening services. The moon hung low in the sky as she quietly trailed him through the wooded area behind the church. She kept her distance as Dixon entered a dilapidated shed that no one had paid attention to for years. Through the cracked windows, she saw him speaking to a figure, another man, disheveled, pleading with the pastor. Eleanor could see the desperate fear in the man's eyes. As she stepped closer, her breath caught when she heard Dixon's voice, low and calming. "You have to trust me," he said. "This is the only way to save your family. You will be healed. The miracle will be worth it. But there is a price. It is the only way." Eleanor recoiled, her heart racing. She barely understood what was happening, but the words sent a chill down her spine. The man, shaking, nodded. "Whatever it takes. I just want my son back." It was then that Eleanor realized something unspeakable was happening. The miracles, the sudden cures, the inexplicable healings, the unexplainable transformations, had a darker origin. They came at the expense of human life. She had to know more, so she started digging deeper. Over the next few days, she quietly followed the pastor again. This time, she found herself at the same shed, hidden behind a veil of trees. As she peered inside, she witnessed a terrifying ritual. Pastor Dixon, in his robes, stood over the lifeless body of a man, his hands raised high in prayer, chanting in a language Eleanor didn't recognize. The air was thick with incense, and the room hummed with an eerie energy. The man, who had once been healthy and full of life, was now nothing more than a sacrifice for a miracle. Eleanor realized with growing horror that this wasn't just some prayer of healing. It was a ritual, a blood offering, a human sacrifice. The pastor had been using these dark rites to perform his miracles. Her heart pounded as she stumbled back into the forest, too terrified to speak, but too compelled to stop. Over the next few days, she quietly documented everything she saw, every detail, every conversation, every chilling moment. She even began to suspect that Dixon was planning to offer up someone she knew, perhaps even someone in the congregation who was set to become his next miracle. She feared for the life of the elderly Mrs. Ford, whose cancer was in its final stages. Eleanor knew she had to act. As the day of revelation approached, Eleanor gathered her courage and confronted the pastor. She waited until he was alone in the church office, quietly sitting at his desk, reading his Bible. The truth was unbearable, but she could no longer live with the fear of knowing what he was doing to people in the name of God. "Pastor," she said, her voice trembling, "I know what you're doing." He looked up, his gaze steady and calm, yet there was something cold behind his eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about, Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth. "You've always been such a good and faithful servant. But there are things beyond your understanding. The miracles, the healings, they are gifts. Gifts I've been entrusted with to save the suffering." "At what cost?" Eleanor asked, her voice rising with fury. "You've been using people. You've been offering their lives as sacrifices so you can perform these miracles. They're not gifts. They're lies." Dixon stood up slowly, his expression unchanged, but his hands trembled slightly as he placed a Bible down on his desk. "Your faith is weak, Eleanor. You never understood the true power of God. You never understood the price of salvation. If you want to expose me, go ahead. But know this, I have saved more lives than you can count. And if that means a few souls must be sacrificed, so be it." Eleanor, her heart breaking for the lives lost, didn't back down. She had already contacted the authorities, anonymously submitting the evidence she'd gathered. It was only a matter of time before the truth would be known. Days later, the town woke to a horrific scene. Police swarmed the church, searching every corner, every room, every hidden place. Pastor Dixon was arrested, his demeanor eerily calm as officers took him into custody. The shed behind the church was uncovered, revealing the remains of multiple victims, each one a part of a dark pact made in exchange for miracles. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Dixon had been using human sacrifice to gain power over life and death, all in the name of his twisted version of divine intervention. The town was shaken to its core. The man they had trusted for so long, the pastor who had performed miracles before their very eyes, was nothing more than a monster hiding behind a veil of faith. Eleanor, though shaken by what she had learned, stood tall. She had exposed the truth, no matter the cost. The town slowly began to heal, but the scars of the past would remain. As for Pastor Dixon, his trials were just beginning, and as the authorities continued to investigate, more and more chilling secrets came to light. Secrets that no one, not even the most faithful, could have ever imagined. As the investigation continued to unfold, the town of New Hope slowly began to process the horrifying truth. Pastor Samuel Dixon's arrest had rocked the very foundation of their faith. For years, they had placed their trust in him, believing his miracles to be signs of divine intervention. Now, they were faced with the cold reality that the man they had revered had been using their lives, and the lives of others, as part of a grotesque ritual. Eleanor watched the events unfold with a mixture of relief and deep sorrow. She had saved lives, but the town was irreparably changed. The sense of betrayal was palpable. The once welcoming church became a place of sorrow and dread. Where there had once been hope, now there was only the shadow of a man who had abused his power for his own twisted desires. News outlets from all over the country began to swarm New Hope, eager to uncover every detail of Dixon's crimes. As reporters dug deeper, more chilling revelations came to light. Dixon's network of victims stretched farther than anyone could have imagined. The authorities discovered that his influence had spread to neighboring towns, and he had used his charismatic presence to draw vulnerable people into his web. Families desperate for answers had been lured into a false sense of security, thinking that Dixon's promises of miracles were the work of God. The police found more evidence in the church itself: hidden journals, cryptic writings, and photographs of the rituals he had conducted in the dark. Dixon's followers had left detailed records of their involvement, many of them unaware of the true cost of their participation. Some had come seeking healing for themselves, others for loved ones. The truth was stacked. The miracles that had saved them had been paid for with blood. As the evidence mounted, the town's residents began to ask themselves how they could have been so blind. How had they allowed a man to control their lives with such ease? Some were angry, others confused, but all of them felt the deep sting of betrayal. Many had lost loved ones, those who had been the victims of Dixon's horrific acts. The families of the missing people, the ones who had been lost in the shadows of Dixon's miracles, began to demand justice. And then there were the survivors, the people who had once been saved by Dixon's supposed miracles, now realizing the horrific price they had paid. A woman who had been healed of cancer was left grappling with guilt, knowing that her life had come at the cost of another person's. A man who had regained his sight struggled with the knowledge that someone else had been sacrificed so that he could see again. They all carried the heavy burden of what they had unwittingly participated in, and the town's healing process seemed impossible. Weeks later, Dixon stood trial. The courtroom was packed with townspeople, some with faces full of anger, others with tears. Eleanor attended every day, sitting in the back of the room, watching the man who had caused so much pain in her community. Dixon's demeanor was chillingly calm. He showed no remorse, only a cold, calculated demeanor that sent shivers down the spines of everyone who witnessed it. He insisted that his actions had been justified, that he had only been a servant of God, doing what was necessary to deliver salvation to those who needed it. His defense attorneys argued that Dixon had been acting in faith, that he had believed he was carrying out a divine mission. They claimed that his actions, while shocking, were an attempt to save lives, not take them. But it was an argument that was impossible to believe in light of the overwhelming evidence. The bodies, the rituals, the victims who had been drained of life in exchange for so-called miracles. As the trial went on, new survivors came forward. Some had been coerced into participating in Dixon's rituals, believing they were part of something holy. Others had witnessed the ceremonies, but had been too afraid to speak out. As the testimonies piled up, the extent of Dixon's manipulation became clear. The prosecutor's case was strong, and Dixon's fate seemed sealed. Finally, after weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. The town waited in agonizing silence for the verdict. Eleanor had watched in disbelief as Dixon had maintained his innocence, but now it seemed that the truth would prevail. The gavel came down, and Dixon was found guilty on all counts: murder, human sacrifice, and manipulation. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The moment the verdict was read, a wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Some people wept with relief, while others, still in disbelief, struggled to comprehend the scale of the tragedy that had unfolded under their noses. Dixon was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of stoic indifference, as if he were walking toward a higher purpose. Eleanor left the courthouse that day with mixed feelings. She had exposed the truth, but the cost had been staggering. In the weeks that followed, the church building was left abandoned. It was a symbol of shattered trust. People moved on, seeking solace in other places, but the scars remained. Those who had once believed in the miracles had to reconcile with the fact that they had been part of something terrible. They no longer knew who to turn to, where to place their faith. For Eleanor, the town's healing process was long and painful. She was still haunted by the images of what she had witnessed in that dark shed, the desperate cries of the victims, and the chilling chants of the ritual. She couldn't forget the look in Dixon's eyes, the calm, calculating gaze of a man who believed that his actions were justified, even in the face of unimaginable evil. As time went on, Eleanor became more involved in helping the survivors, offering support to those who were left with the emotional scars of Dixon's influence. Many of them struggled to forgive themselves, believing they had been complicit in Dixon's actions, even though they had no idea what was truly happening behind closed doors. Eleanor knew that healing would take time, but she made it her mission to ensure that the truth would never be forgotten, and that Dixon's reign of terror would never be allowed to happen again. And though the church building sat empty, its pews long abandoned, Eleanor found comfort in the knowledge that the town had found its strength in the face of darkness. The truth had been revealed, and though it had torn apart everything they once knew, it had also given them the chance to rebuild, this time on a foundation of transparency, faith, and truth. Pastor Dixon, imprisoned and forgotten by the world, would be left to rot in a cell, a man who had once been a beacon of hope, now nothing more than a shadow of a past that would never be allowed to return.